said B-roll of nature.
You're part of nature. Oh, let's have you like sitting on the ground in here. Sit in the middle there. Okay, we are rolling.
Where are we heading?
We're heading over there.
Hey, thanks for doing this with me, man.
You're welcome. It's fun. Recently, I have fallen in love with shooting on Hi8 camcorders like this one right here. I recently did a video about how you can make Hi8 camcorders look cinematic and how some of the characteristics of the Hi8 camcorder can actually lend itself to better visual storytelling. And while I still stand by all of those things, one of the things I didn't really talk about too much is how much I enjoy using the Hi8 camera just as a normal video camera. If you've never had the pleasure of using one of these, the ergonomics and the shooting experience is nothing like shooting on a mirrorless camera. Just between the way that it fits into your hand, having the big screen and the huge viewfinder, the dad cam kind of stance is very easy to achieve with a camera like this. And I find that the shooting experience is just so conducive to run and gun shooting and creativity. I enjoy the shooting experience of this camera so much that I used it to record multiple music videos for a buddy of mine just last night. And the results I am extremely happy with. Here's a few clips of the finished product. Now, it's worth mentioning that the footage straight out of camera does not look like this right away. There is a good amount of post-processing that I do to my clips to make them look the way that they do right now. So jumping right into what I actually do to process my clips, the first thing that I do is I add noise reduction to them. Now, it might seem a little bit weird to do that. After all, the characteristics of the Hi8 camcorder are the reason why we are using it, or at least that's one of the reasons. But I actually find that I prefer to add my own noise in post-production. Specifically, I use a plugin called Dehancer. Now, Dehancer, if you don't know, is one of the best film emulation plugins that you can get. I've tried a handful of them and none of them even touch the quality that you get from Dehancer Pro. I really just don't want the noise from the camera to be competing with the noise that I add. So the first thing I do to these clips is I add a bit of noise reduction. The second thing I do is I use a frame rate emulator. Now, I'll leave a link in the description to where you can get this exact plugin. Essentially what this does is exactly what it sounds like. It takes footage that was recorded in one frame rate and it emulates it to make it look like it was recorded in another. Now, this is important when working with a Hi8 camera because as you can see here, this was recorded at 58.82 frames per second. Now, I don't know the science behind this. I don't really know why it's such a weird frame rate. It might have something to do with this video converter that I use to actually get the footage from the Hi8 camera, but that doesn't really bother me too much. All I do is I use this frame rate emulator, and I find that it gives me a really good 24 frames per second feel. I don't know how this thing works. It's kind of magic, but that's the second thing I do to process these clips. The third thing I do is I use a color board effect. Shout out to my Final Cut Pro users out there that understand and have learned to use the color board. I actually kind of like it. If you don't like it, there's other ways to process color in Final Cut Pro, as well as other plugins that you can use, such as Dehancer. But I actually like to use a color board effect, and I use this interesting kind of curve for my saturation. I actually like to lower the saturation in my highlights, boost it in the midtones, and boost it even more for the shadows. So that's what I do for the saturation. For these clips, I actually found that I wanted the midtones to be a little bit brighter. Part of the reason I wanted that to be the case is, well, really for two reasons. Number one, when we're shooting videos, we want our skin tones to be around 70% IRE. Now, if you don't know what IRE is, it's basically a measurement of the exposure of any given part of your shot. Now, this can be represented by the waveforms that we're looking at over here. And as you can see, they're actually a little bit lower, especially our midtones. So, my friend is right here. His face is actually around here, kind of closer to 60% IRE. And so we're actually going to want to boost that to get it closer to that 70%. This kind of only applies for, outdoor shots or shots like this one right here. Obviously, everything's situational, so you might not want to follow this like 70% IRE rule if you were to for example, shoot a shot that is backlit, for example. So we're going to turn this effect back on. As you can see, I boosted the midtones to kind of get his skin tone to be a little bit brighter, and now we're getting closer to that 75% IRE mark. And then I lowered the shadows just a tad to add more contrast. So with that out of the way, let's jump right into Dehancer. If you haven't had the pleasure of working with Dehancer, there are so many features built into it that make adding just these fun little stylistic flares to your shot just absolutely incredible. So the first thing that we're going to want to click is the Rec 709 source. And of course, if I click choose camera, we're not going to find the camera that we actually shot this with because all of these cameras are relatively new. So what we're going to do is just set this to Rec 709 and move on. I did want to give the shot a bit of a warmer feel, and so I boosted the temperature a little bit. One little thing that I find, and this is personal preference, is that as long as your tint is dialed in, so basically as long as your shot isn't too green or too magenta, you can kind of dial in the temperature based on just personal preference and feeling. Now, that might be controversial to some, but I find that it's okay for white in your scene to not actually be white. It can just kind of be whatever color temperature you feel like is best suited for the shot. And obviously in real life, the color temperature ranges from all sorts of different values. And so since this was recorded at golden hour, I felt like it was more appropriate to warm up the shot and give it that kind of nice golden hue. So I did boost my color temperature a bit towards the warmer side while also adding just a tad bit of green to the shot. So moving on to the film emulation, I actually don't use film emulation nearly as much as you might think I would inside of an app that's designed to emulate film stocks. I find that a lot of these other features are a lot more useful. So sometimes I will just turn this off, and honestly, the shot still looks great. I would say that it's a bit oversaturated. So if I turn my color board off, which is, if you remember, is where we added our saturation earlier, this shot looks really good as is. But the reason why we added so much saturation is because this film stock actually kind of saps a lot of the saturation from the scene. So the next thing I want to talk about is the film print. So the film print is really going to add a sort of a consistent feeling as far as like contrast, exposure, and saturation goes across the image. I do really like using this because I find that it pulls the image together in a really pleasing way. I also like a lot of the tools in here. For example, the tonal contrast is one of the best contrast sliders that I've ever used. I find that it doesn't seem to like overdo it, and it looks really good. So the next thing I want to show you is the film grain setting. Now the film grain, as you can see, there are a lot of different film grain profiles ranging from 8mm film to 16 to 35 and even 65mm. And I find that this 65mm, especially the 50 ISO stock, is really good if you just want to add a little bit of grain to the shot, but you don't want to have just the grain just pouring out of the screen. I find that this is a very conservative one to use if you just kind of want a little bit of that stylistic flair. But for this shot and for our purposes today, I think I'm going to go with the 35mm 50 ISO stock. I find that that looks really, really good. One thing that Dehancer does extremely well, and one of the things that makes it really stand out when compared to other film emulation programs, is the halation. So checking this on and off, you can see what it's doing basically in areas of high contrast where there is a sharp divide between highlights and shadows. So for example, if we zoom in here to this basketball court, I'm going to go ahead and turn the halation on and off. Obviously, this is doing a lot. You may or may not like this, but what halation basically is sometimes when you're shooting on film, the light can bounce back and forth within the layers of the film stock itself, and it can create this sort of outline effect. You might like it, you might not. Luckily, if you don't like it, you can just turn it off, but I actually think I'm going to leave it on. So moving on from halation, we have bloom. Now, bloom is exactly what it sounds like. Essentially, it adds a glow to your highlights, and that's very apparent if I check this on and off. I actually think this looks really cool, so I'm going to leave it on. And I find that the default, which is for a lot of these 35mm film stock, is actually just really great. I find that it's a good happy medium, so we're just going to leave it. Film damage. Film damage is extremely fun. If I go ahead and play this shot, sometimes you will see a little specks hitting the frame. They kind of come and go, so they're hard to see. I just saw one right there. Again, I just think it adds a little special something to the image, and I just really like adding these elements because I just find that they're really fun, and you don't get them when using other tools. So that's basically how I process my clips. I've really enjoyed using these Hi8 cameras for my projects. I hope to use more analog video formats as time goes on, such as VHS-C and Mini DV. But for the time being, I'm really enjoying this Hi8 camera. I find that these results are just very unique, you know, in an era where all of our video clips are just so high quality and sharp. Having something a bit simpler is just something that I've gotten a lot of joy out of.